So welcome everybody on behalf of the Bartholomew County Historical Society. I want to welcome you to our Evelyn Seward speaker series. So my name is Evelyn. I'm the education manager for the Bartholomew County Historical Society. We also have Jared Anderson, our collections and curator manager. Oh, it works. Oh, hey, there we go. So we also have Jared Anderson, Devin Mollison, our media manager, and then Diane Robbins, our executive director. So we want to thank you all for coming. So it is my honor to introduce Brenda Pitts and Paulette, who together have spent years researching the history of the Black community in the county, from its establishment, where they came from, how their lives have changed after the decades they have been here. So we're very appreciative of Brenda and Paulette for their work in the community and for giving this presentation. And we hope you enjoy and learn something tonight. So I will turn the mic over to Brenda and Paulette.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here tonight, not only for this opportunity to share a little bit of the history of Blacks in Bartholomew County, but also as an honor to Evelyn Seward. This is a real honor for me because when I was in high school, Miss Seward was one of the teachers. And what she did pertains to what's happening tonight in our discussion. Because even though I didn't know her and had no classes with her, when I was in high school, she came up to a friend and I and said, "Hey, would you girls like to go to the ballet over in Bloomington at IU?" It was an experience that we had never had and probably wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for her generosity. So we didn't have a close relationship, but she was actively involved in the civil rights movement in Columbus, Indiana, and Bartholomew County. And this was her way of taking individual action. So thank you, Ms. Seward. Now, Paulette and I, the story of African Americans, or Blacks as I will refer tonight, just because it's shorter, is, according to one of the newspaper articles, as old as the history of the county itself. In fact, Paulette will talk about one of the first sermon preached in Bartholomew County was by a Black Baptist minister. The first person documented in Bartholomew County was in the 1830 census and in some of the government courthouse records. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. As we take this journey, these are just a few of the photos of people whose lives were lived here and who we will be talking about tonight. So we'll begin, and I'll talk about the early days. And keep in mind these photos, because this is how people got here in the early days. There wasn't a train or anything, so what you had to do was to put your goods into a covered wagon. If you didn't have oxen, get you a couple of oxen, because you were going to need them later. And then you walked all the way from wherever you were to here. Now, we are focusing on freedom because sometimes we think of freedom purely from the perspective of being legally free. But Black people wanted much more than that. They wanted to be able to be their authentic selves and to fulfill their potential. So that's the reason that they came to Bartholomew County. They wanted to express themselves, they wanted opportunities, and they wanted to be the best that they can be. And we'll talk a little bit about whether or not that happened. Now, I want you to go back in your mind. I don't think any of us were there at this point in time, but the American Revolutionary War. And remember how we just, as a country, the citizens here, were just so upset because they felt that there was such tyranny over them by Britain, and they hated the way that Britain treated them. So that they fought back, and we had the American Revolutionary War. My ancestors, as well as other blacks, fought in that war. And so when that war was over and when freedom was won, we thought, well, we're going to be free too, just like everyone else. So that was the key thing, and it's what drove the abolitionists during the 1800s. And as you think about freedom, think about how excited we are in this community when one of our favorite athletic teams wins a state championship or the Super Bowl or whatever. That's the kind of freedom fervor there was back after the war. So that carried over to when they were writing the Constitution, and some of those founding fathers, even though they were slave owners, wanted to be this all-encompassing statement about freedom, that freedom applied to all people, although that was not the practice. So we were excited as a country. We wanted to expand. We wanted to become a world power. And as such, it was getting a little crowded in those original 13 states. So if you look at this, the blue represents the new areas that once we had our freedom, we went out to pursue to expand our country and provide more opportunity. Well, in order for people to go out there, we had to incent them. So as a country, we said, we'll give you either free land or low-priced land. And of course, there were so many opportunities out there that we could see ourselves making a new way for ourselves. Now, blacks felt the same as whites, with the exception that when most of us were living in the South at that time, and this was about the time that things were also in the 1800s, a lot of our rights were being taken away because people were more and more concerned about preserving the institution of slavery. So blacks thought, well, we're going to go north too and west, and we'll have more freedom and opportunities than we had here in the South. So we're expecting this great life. We're headed for the promised land. So our forefathers and foremothers came here for freedom, liberty, and opportunity. However, what did they find when they got here? Since I love to read, one quote that always has stood out to me is the introduction to A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times and the worst of times, light and dark. And I applied this to what life was like in Bartholomew County for blacks, that there were good people here and not so good people. And there were racist people here and not racist people. There were people that were friends, there were opportunities, there were good times. So as you think about our conversation tonight, think of the complexity of it with a lot of nuances, because nothing is either good or bad. And I think you'll be surprised at the conclusion that we come up with. So these early pioneers, who were they? They predominantly came from Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky, which is strange in a way to think of people coming up from Kentucky, but that's where the people came to Bartholomew County, the blacks. There were three groups of blacks that came. One would be people who had been free for quite a while, or who had always been free. The second would be the people who were newly free. And third would be those who were seeking their freedom and were escaping from slavery. In the 1830 census, there were 6 blacks listed. And some of those it was probably about 2 families, because one of those people listed was Nancy Tyler, who was in the records, and we have the record of where Bartholomew County gave her something like $12 because she was, needed money to support herself and her 2 children. So that was a real act of generosity that was here. The people who came here were farmers, skilled trades, servants or maids, and laborers. So that's why we were here. Now, life was very difficult when you got here for those early settlers, because just think about it. This area was wonderful. It was great for farming. And if you had ever go into a forest and you see all of the huge trees, just stop to think about the fact that if you're going to settle there, someone's got to cut all of those key trees down and pull out the stumps. There's a lot of things happening at the same time though. So not only do you have to clear the land, you have to get it cleared, get the crops in so your family has something to eat, and you have something to sell, and you have to provide some kind of housing. So you have to use those big families you had in order to try to get all of this done. And usually, like most of these families, there were 9 or 10 children, so you can imagine how fun it was living in a small log cabin with 12 people. I want to share the story of my family. My family moved here in the mid-1840s, and they came from Robeson County, North Carolina. The story that was passed down through our family was that my great-great-great-grandfather, John Blanks, was wanting to provide, had 9 children, and was wanting to provide a better life for them. So he was a shoe cobbler in North Carolina, and I can imagine there probably wasn't that many shoes back there to support a family of 12 people. So he needed a better opportunity. So he packed up his wagon, got him some oxen, and headed off for that 650-mile trip from Robeson County, North Carolina, to the wonderful community of Bartholomew County. So they arrived in the mid-1840s. Now, the woman on the right is my great-great-grandmother, Anna Blanks, his daughter. His son, Willis, is below, and Anna's son, Alex, is to the top left. Now, this family was one of the last families left in this county in 1860. And we'll cover what happened during the 1860 period. Because in the by 1861, all of the blacks here had left town. I would also mention that there was an Underground Railroad effort here that was led by the Quakers in Azalea. And over the period of time, it's a highly secret organization, so there's not a lot of details that were written, but it's estimated that they had saved about 100 runaway slaves. So, back to the reason why everyone left. We really don't know for sure, and there's been a lot of people that have researched it to try to find out. But what we do know that is in the early 1850s, there was a lot of activity going on, not only in this country, but in this community. And the antagonism against blacks was building. There were more blacks moving from the south to the north. There were more people moving from Europe here, and resources were becoming scarce. And anytime you have that type of situation, you have animosity building. In addition to that, with the country expanding, The slave owners wanted to make sure that their power was never diminished so that they could hold on to their economy. So they wanted to make sure that the states, that there were an equal number of slave-holding states as non-slave-holding states. So the result of all of this uproar was that there was in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, which is one of the major pieces of legislation in this whole effort. Because what it said is if you were to help a runaway slave, there would be severe consequences. You could be fined, jail, whatever. Now, if you were a black person and you were the slave, then what it meant was that you could not testify on your behalf. So you were automatically drugged down. Even worse than that, though, is if you were a free black person, you could also be sold into slavery, because even with your papers, it didn't matter because blacks were not allowed to testify. So the result was that in 1851, the state of Indiana decided to amend its constitution. And when it did that, it said, first of all, we don't want any more blacks moving into our state, so keep heading north. Second, you don't have any rights now. So you can't vote, you can't serve in the military, you can't testify in court, your children can't go to a white school, you're just dead out of luck. And on top of that, you have to register at the county office so that we know and guarantee your behavior, good behavior, through paying a fine or providing a bond. Now, little did they know that that has become a gold mine for people like me, genealogists, because I can go back and not only find the name of my ancestors, I can find descriptions of what they looked like, where they were from, and confirm when they were born. So there was a positive that came out of all of that. So now, I'll turn it over to Paulette and let her cover the next 100 years where things improved. We're now past the Civil War and we're up for freedom.
I feel like I'm 100 years old. Okay, we're going to talk about the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Industrial Age, and the World Wars. A little bit about me. I'm not a native of Indiana. I am from Kentucky. My family came to Kentucky through Virginia and South Carolina as slaves. On my dad's side, I would say, that Harriet was the matriarch slave of the family, and she was brought to Kentucky by way of Virginia by anyone in here has ever heard of John Combs, the father of the 8 children. And he brought Harriet with him, and they became very close and produced my great-grandfather. And from that, I have the lineage of the Cummins family. On my mom's side, it was very easy to trace, so I can't share that. I've been in Columbus for about 50 years, since 1970. And there have been lots of things that have happened since I've been here. So I may put a few of those little interesting tags in there. So Columbus has had its ups and downs, goods and bads. Okay. When we talk about the Civil War. We all know that the Civil War was between the North and the South. And it was a dispute about slavery. Some people say it was a dispute about other things, but we know that it was a dispute about slavery. We can't say that it's not. The Civil War brought on a lot of, let's say, things that were not very good, but a lot of the slaves were able to cross over to the Union and help fight to win the war. The Reconstruction time. Reconstruction was supposed to be a time where things were going to change. And I don't think they changed very much. We did have the 13th Amendment passed in 1865, which allowed the outlawing of slavery. Then we had the 14th Amendment that passed, which provided citizenship to all the slaves. And then, of course, was the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was about voting rights. Guess who got voting rights? The men! We didn't get voting rights until when? 1920-ish. So we continue on through the Reconstruction, and up comes Jim Crow. Wow. Things have started happening. After the Civil War, we find that the people in the South wanted to have their slaves back. They wanted to revert back to what had been going on before, during slavery. They pulled the federal troops out of the South, and everything converted back to segregation, even though it was illegal. We move right along here, and we come to the Industrial Age. The Industrial Age was helpful and it wasn't helpful. At that time, they had a lot of poor whites and a lot of people who were ex-slaves. Mostly the poor whites got the jobs in the industries, and the slaves still were laborers on the farms and setting up barber shops and being domestics and so forth. Then we come to the World Wars. We had people who served in the Revolutionary War, World War I, World War II. And my dad, even though he wasn't from Indiana, he was mustered out up here at Atterbury in 1946. And I didn't realize that when I came to Columbus that my dad had been here before. He visited Little Harlem. What Little Harlem is? Little Harlem was the bar down on Hay Street. Okay, let's see here. We have here a picture of Uncle Will and Creed, his brother, coming out of the Little Harlem, and the picture was a little bit bigger. You can see in Uncle Will's hand, paper bag with his favorite drink. The Little Harlem was a place where the World War II Army guys from Atterbury came down to Columbus to have fun. At that time, the bar was owned by Albert Phillips, and the Phillips family still lives around here. You have Roxanne and Kathy and a couple of their kids that still live here. And Albert, he wasn't able to get his liquor license right away. He didn't have that. But there was a Reverend Washington, who spoke up for him and for the troops to say that we need this. You don't want them coming into your bars. So guess what? Reverend Washington convinced the city that he needed this liquor license. So he got the liquor license, and Little Harbor flourished for a while. We had other people who owned Little Harbor. Our black entrepreneurs. We had lots of people who had barbershops down on Washington Street. For example, you had the Hanleys at a barbershop. You have, I think he owned 9 different barbershops. I guess going from one store to the next to shop shoes. And we had Elmer Goins, who also owned a barbershop, and he owned a rooming house of 23 rooms. Most of the black people stayed there. They stopped calling it a rooming house because it was too big to be called a rooming house. It had 23 rooms. It was a hotel. And it was located over here between 4th Street Bar and PNC Bank. I'm not sure if the PNC Bank is still there or not, but where it used to be. That parking lot, that empty parking lot is where the Goins Hotel was located. Now, the family that you see here in the picture, this is, these are relatives of my husband's family, Booker family. He was adopted out of that family. He became a Roberts. They had a sawmill down in Grammar, and they sawed wood and soldered buckets and anything that could be fixed to earn a living. This family also, they call themselves medical people. They were able to, they had this big book that all kinds of remedies in the book to heal this and heal that. But there was a disease that broke out back then, scarlet fever. So they had to be quarantined for at least 6 weeks or so. And during that time, the health people came in and said, well, we have to burn everything. So they decided that this one book they were going to hide, because it had all the recipes for healing all kinds of diseases. So they hid the book, and all the other books were burned, and everything else in the house. But this family were true entrepreneurs, and they kept this land for many, many years. And along the way, a cousin named Tommy bought the land back after it had been sold, and in his will, he willed it to his wife's daughter, and his wife's daughter sold it before any of the other family members knew about it, so it's gone. Okay, we see here a picture of church members standing along the side of Second Baptist Church, which is over on 9th and Reed. The first sermon that was preached in Bartholomew County was by a black man at a bar, and the patrons were getting kind of wild and active, and one, I believe it was the owner that came in with this preacher. And he came in with this fire and brimstone message. The patrons got very upset about him being there, but as he preached to them, they finally settled down and everything was hunky-dory. We had a group called the New Lights, and they baptized both black and white. There was this preacher they called Black Aaron, and he was also a fire and brimstone preacher. He preached to the top of his voice, everyone in the area could hear, and he spread the message of the Lord. Blacks around this area at first would go to white churches, and it got to a point where they were no longer welcome, so they formed their own church. They formed Second Baptist Church and a Methodist church. The Methodist church did not last very long. I think it was formed in 1841, and it went down, and then it was brought back up several times. And the last name was St. Luke's, and it was over there on 16th and Pennsylvania, I believe. So Second Baptist is still standing, and it's the only black building place in Columbus that is still operating. It's 144 years old. The church has sustained the faith of people living through very difficult circumstances, and they provided support to black families. The church was used for social activities. They even had an embroidery club. They sold chicken dinners. They did all kinds of things out of the church to bring the black community together. And as things moved on, people moved on, other churches were formed, and I think we have about 6 black churches with a handful of members. Education. Education in Columbus, Indiana was, let's say, the high school kids that were high school age were able to go to school with the whites, but the elementary kids could not. There was a room at Central School where black kids were taught in a room with just black kids. You had playgrounds that were, one section was for whites, one section was for blacks. Even though these kids might see each other on the streets, talk, play ball together, when it came to education, they were separated. Then Central was tore down a couple times and rebuilt. At one point, there was a building that was moved from the Central land over to 14th and Union to provide a place for black elementary school age children to go to school. And Mr. Johnson, Charles Johnson, I believe, was the teacher there who provided education for these students. After this school closed, it was 45 years later before another black teacher was hired in Bartholomew County. It wasn't by BCSC, it was by St. Columbo. And then it took a long time after that before other black teachers were hired. And that was in the late 60s. And each year, more black teachers were hired. And I was hired in 1970. And I taught in the system for 33 years. Jesse Clark, another entrepreneur, a blind black guy who was a peddler. You would say that he operated in the first farmer's market. He peddled food all over town. One unique thing about Jesse was that I guess his mom saw information about a contest. So she encouraged him to enter this contest. So he entered the contest. They didn't know what he looked like or anything. So they chose his slogan. And I guess after they had selected his slogan, they said, we're going to bring this guy in and see who he is. And he walks in, you know, he's kind of ignored him. Surely this wasn't the guy, but it was, and they finally accepted his slogan as the one that they were going to keep. We move on to voting rights and justice. We have, over at Second Baptist today, we have a sign that talks about voting rights. These two ladies, Fanny and Lizzie, they were brave enough to walk down to the courthouse and say that they were going to register to vote. And that's what they did. And you think, back then, to be brave enough to do that, I would probably have been right behind them. But Fanny also was a helper in the black school. She does not have a grave marker out at the graveyard, but we're going to work on that. And we look down here at Gary Owsley case. We hope that one day that case is going to be solved, because there are a lot of things that happened that shouldn't have happened. And his sister, I know, is not ever going to give up until that case has been solved. Housing. When we look at housing in Columbus, Indiana, well, back in the late and early 60s, we find that most of the black people in Columbus, of course, lived in the worst areas. There was an area over in Miller's Park where a lot of the blacks lived. Then there was Jackson Street, right in the area where the Cummins corporate building is. A lot of blacks lived in that area. And of course, 9th Street, Union Street, Circle Drive, and East Columbus. There have been times where these black people were not able to get a house. And that was one of the reasons why the Laws Foundation and the Human Rights Commission was established to give these people support in order to find a home. And Mr. Edge lived here for over a year in an apartment, trying to find a home to bring his family here. It took him a long time to find a place. And that the kids still have a farm that they finally purchased and moved to Columbus, Indiana. Then we have Mickey King and Ann King, who finally found a home on Parkside Drive to live in. But if you were moving out of the so-called black area, it was hard. And in the neighborhood regulations, there were codes built into those land lots that you didn't sell to a black person. So it takes a while to break down things that we know shouldn't be. But today, even myself, when my husband and I got married in 1973, I said, I want a house. We had only been married 6 months. So we saved every penny that came into that house. We bought a little house up in Pleasant View, off of 31 near Edinburgh, Indiana. One day, I was getting the mail out of the mailbox, and out pops this little note that really infuriated me. And I told my husband when he got home, and not anyone know my husband. He marched up and down that street trying to find out who put that note in his mailbox. And it better not happen again. So of course, one of the other kids told who did it. He didn't hurt him. Community. For the most part, blacks in Columbus lived in certain areas. They socialized together. One of the activities that they did was something called cakewalks. I had no idea what a cakewalk was until I moved to Columbus, Indiana. And they had dancers that would perform in front of white folks and black folks here in Columbus to see who would win the cake. And I said, oh, that's odd. And I said, okay, that's what you guys do. Okay. We had segregated movies. I had the opportunity one day to go up in the top of the Crump Theater. Up there in the top, there are some seats for me. And I just wondered. I was huffing and puffing by the time I got up there, and I stumbled, almost broke my leg. I said, goodness gracious, the old folks probably didn't go to the movies. But it's up there, and I hope that they preserve it so that everybody can go up there and see what it looks like. It's like an arena with wooden planks. And there was very little interracial dating, but some happened, just like any other place. They got together and dated. For example, there was this guy, I won't say who he was. He would carry this white girl's books to class for her. That was the closest he got to dating her. Then was Donner. Donner Pool was open to all because of J.I. Miller. And of course, J.I. Miller did a lot of things to make sure that things were equal for all races. Brenda, you want to come up and talk about this?
So, because there were so few blacks living not only in Bartholomew County, but these other counties in the counties surrounding us, and we didn't participate in the communities in which we live, that we formed our own community that spanned all of these counties. So these are the counties where if there were social groups formed, the social groups would cover all of these counties. So when we had Eastern Star, because there was a Black Eastern Star and Black Mesa, they were not just for Bartholomew County, they covered all of these counties, because you had to do that to get enough members. Growing up here, with my family having migrated here from the south, which would be Vernon and Hanover, so those of you who grew up here know what large communities those were. And as we grew up, when I was about 2, we decided to move here for greater opportunities, because other than work at Hanover College, there was not much going on in Hanover. So we moved up here, but we maintained all of those contacts. So you dated across those units, you partied across those units. And although we had a separate community, we had a ball. Don't you guys think so? I remember on Sunday nights, we would go to Franklin, Indiana, and the skating rink is still there. And that was ours for skating. And you would have people coming from Indianapolis and from southern Indiana gathering there. And then, even though it was a school night, we managed to sneak in a party after the skating rink closed. There were also dances that were held, but our dances were unique, so we didn't spend a lot of time going to school dances. We had these dances that were composed of adults and teenagers. And there's not a whole lot you can do when your uncles and aunts and father was there. So it was very safe and clean, and we all had a good time. So I say that to say that even though the way I describe this community was, it was sort of a soft segregation. There weren't signs up or anything like that, but you knew where to go and where not to go. Now, these are a couple of people from Dennis's family, and this is an amazing family. They were in slavery in Kentucky. They went across the Ohio River into Madison. They caught the train and they asked the conductor, where can we go with our family on $2? And he said, look, go to Jennings County, because those people are really nice and they'll take care of you. And that's where they settled. Eventually, some of them came here and moved. And this is notable because these 2 sisters reached the highest office in Indiana in the Black Eastern Stars, and were responsible for 5,000 women. So it was quite an amazing feat. It's never happened again. And their brother was Grant Smith, who was a successful barber here. So they have a fantastic story. So if we summarize that 100 years that Paulette was covering, their freedom was a little bit better and more attainable than it was before the Civil War, but there was still a ways to go. Now, on civil rights, up until today, when I started doing my genealogy, and particularly for this area, I have to include almost all of the Black families in Bartholomew County, just so that I can understand what the interconnections are. So I took a shot at listing what were some of those Black families that came back to Bartholomew County after the Civil War, and whose descendants still live here. So you have, of course, the Johnson family, as well as the Fresher family. And Mr. Fresher's story was an amazing one. He came here, they came up from North Vernon like a lot of people did, had no money, but he worked hard to buy that 100 acres near Hope, and it's still in the family today. And if you read the newspaper recently, they received an award for, I think it was like a homestead award for that land being in their family for 100 years. And their temple is located on that land, and they have their own graveyard. And as the next generation comes along, they cut off a piece of the land, and all of their family members live on that piece of land. So it's about 100 acres. Then you have the King family that came here during that time, and that would be his family. So Henry and Nancy King came here. We've heard of Buddy King. This would be his family. So Rick's family has been here forever, and Rick is probably related to half of the old black families in town, because he's also related to this Johnson Day family, aren't you?
Well, yeah, my grandmother was a Johnson.
Okay. So you have all of this, and once when I shared some information from Jennings County with another cousin who was doing some things, he called and he was so excited. He said, "Brenda, do you realize we're related about 6 different ways?" But let me assure you that it was all perfectly legal across the line. There were just a finite group of people, and you only had so many choices to go. So this, a lot of these families, their descendants are still living here. Now, civil rights. I grew up during this period, and as a child, I attended the Columbus school system. Usually was the only black person in my class, but in elementary school, I think they put this other black girl in my class so that I would have someone else to play with. So we worked together throughout elementary school, and then moving on, you get a little broader group of people. Out of my graduating class of 700, I believe there were about 10 black people. So you can imagine what it was, what your life was like during that time. But as I said, we enjoyed it. And Roxanne had made the statement a couple of years ago. She said, "You know, we had a great time growing up here." And part of it was because we were surrounded by great, loving families in that web that I just showed. Since there were all of those cross connections, we had a lot of support. So we grew up, we were able to go to the Girls and the Boys Club. We were able to go to, there was an activity that Parks and Recs would do during the summer at the schools, and we could do those kinds of things. And our parents had raised us that don't you ever let anyone call you out of your name. So we were never bothered when we got called out of our name, which was probably several times, because we took care of business. And our parents wanted to make sure that we always knew that we were as good as anyone else. Now, some people, like my brother here, got into a few more fights than I did, because he played sports and would have to fight his way off of the football field. So when Cummins decided to, in the 1960s, to expand and bring in blacks, and so for those of you who have been around, you probably heard of Bill Norman, Jim Joseph, a lot of people came here. He did so in order to improve this community. And one of the things that Columbus has going for it is the fact that from the 1800s on, we've had a group of very outstanding community leaders who have been concerned about the enlightenment of our community. So it makes this community a little unique. It was not always experienced that way throughout, But there's some things that happened here that were different than what happened in some other communities. So it happened that Mickey King, who we talked about, was playing golf with someone, and he says, oh, gotta go get my hair cut, go to Indianapolis. And the white man he was doing, playing golf with said, why are you going to Indianapolis? He says, we can't get our hair cut here. So we are forced to drive to Indianapolis. So that was the case, except for the local people where we had someone who would come around to Uncle Will's basement and do hair for us. And that's how a lot of people like Kenny and Rick got their hair done. So there was that going on. But nevertheless, it was a situation where all of these new people coming into town from metropolitan areas, they couldn't find homes like Paulette talked about. So they would turn around and leave. And so Mr. Miller ended up meeting with the Kings and with some people from this local community at Rick's parents' home. And they discussed what was going on with Mr. Miller. He was appalled at everything. And I was even saying to this point that Mr. Miller and his family, his ancestors, were always looking out for blacks in this community, providing little jobs, taking care of people where they can, looking out, but I don't think even he realized how bad it could be for some people. So after that, that's what kicked off the work with the Human Rights Commission and the Laws Foundation. The Laws Foundation did a lot of critical work. For example, when I was in school, there was a tutoring program that was held at First Presbyterian Church. They even provided transportation and would pick black students up to come there to be tutored. There were also field trips that were provided, so they would go places like Chicago to get exposure to things that they would not have here in Columbus. They would go to the historically black colleges, and all of this was done with the notion of encouraging, opening up the options for black students. Then you have the Human Rights Commission that was one of the first of its kind. And Carolyn Lickerman, I don't know how many of you know, but Carolyn was one of the people critical in establishing that, as well as several people like Owen Hungerford and some others, Lee Hamilton. There were a large mixed group of leaders who worked on that kind of work, which made Columbus what it is today. Recently, I was talking with Tracy when she took one of our tours, and she was saying how when she first came to Columbus and was working with the Human Rights Commission, she was one of the people who was tasked with going with her supposed husband to rent a place. And what they would do is Tracy and her husband would go in, and then later on, a black couple would go in, and they would compare results. And so that's the data that the Human Rights Commission used in order to integrate housing here in Columbus, Indiana. And there was effectiveness, and they dealt with employment as well. So they were a critical part to this whole thing. The churches started to accept people. So you could now you were accepted in other churches, and several blacks did start to attend other churches. Restaurants were opened up. And during my childhood, we were able to go to movies without having to sit in the nosebleed section. That was the one highlight of our childhood, is going to the Wednesday afternoon matinees.
Brenda, what was the Black Community Center?
The Black Community Center was located over where the old Booker T. Washington School was located on 14th and Union. So it was made as a hangout for Black kids and a central point. I think it was only lasted, they hired a director and everything. So it was a critical part during that time of keeping people, exposing them to more things. Now, the interesting thing about it was that the community center did not have a restroom. So everyone would have to go across the street to the goods house to use the restroom. So Mrs. Good was able to keep up with what was going on. So if I summarize where we are today, there's a lot of positive. In fact, I talked with a couple of people, and we said, looking back over the last few years, the momentum in Columbus has really seemed to pick up when it comes to increasing and addressing inclusion in the community of Columbus, Indiana. So it's been viewed as a real positive. I take it as a positive sign, the fact that I have received 2 letters from people who I grew up with and went to school with who apologized for their behavior towards me. Now, I don't remember what they did, but I know that I probably said something back to them and had an impact on them because they hunted me down to get those letters to me. So I think that shows you the change that is going on in this community. Now, will it be rapid change? No. But there's something that each of us can do to help out. The approach now has to be systematic change. Fortunately, we have a lot of new blood within this community, young, energized leaders who are now jumping in to do things, to work with the students who need help, to expose students, working with other ethnic groups to expand their horizons. So things are improving, and I look forward to things continuing to improve. Now, I would like to end this on a positive note and have Paulette read some of the final stanzas from Amanda Gordon's poem.
I'm sure all of you know who Amanda Gorman is. I love her poetry. The hill we climb, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. Every breath from our bronze-pounded chest, we will rise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the golden hills of the west. We will rise from the wind-swept northeast where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will build, reconcile, and recover. And every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, we will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only You're brave enough to be it. Amanda Gorman's last word. We want to thank you for coming with me and sharing in with your thoughts and ideas. And I want you to just take a moment right now. Close your eyes. Think about being a black person in this world. Think about all the things that you've seen happen. How would you feel? How would you react? And what would you hope for? Open up your eyes.